All right, and we're live.
You're live. Oh, okay. Well, we're live, so let's just come back. Come here. No, he doesn't want to come back now. Hello, hello. It's Tuesday. It's 4 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock Mountain, and also here in Costa Rica, 7 o'clock on the East Coast, midnight in Dublin, 1 a.m. in London and most of Europe, 8:30 and 9:30 a.m. Wednesday morning in Australia, 11:30 a.m. Wednesday morning in New Zealand, and it's Facebook Live and Instagram and YouTube and Zoom. So hello, everyone. Really nice to be with you. And tell us where you're coming from when you say hello here in whatever medium you're using, but tell us where you're coming from. It's always wonderful for me to see how the world really wants this type of information, and people are staying up until 1 and 2 in the morning in Europe and Eastern Europe. And so it's reinforcing for us when we do this work. So say hello and tell us where you're coming from. And it's my honor and great privilege to have with us tonight the person who I consider to be the world leader in the field of neurology, giving us a big picture functional medicine view. So not just locked into the textbooks of neurology, but where does all of this come from? All of these complaints that we get in the world of neurology and our brain function. And my friend, Dr. David Perlmutter is here today. Dr. Perlmutter, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, Dr. Tom O'Brien, delighted to see you again. It's always great to connect virtually now, but who knows what the future holds. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's just an honor. And Dr. Perlmutter has a new book out, which is why I invited him here tonight. And we'll put the link into the book. And when I saw the title, I just started laughing. I said, oh, slam dunk. The title is Drop Acid. And, at first, what? And as you're going to learn tonight, the topic is on uric acid, and which is a marker on most general physical exam blood tests. Most of them will look at that. And when it's elevated, we've all been trained to consider it an indicator the person is on the way to developing gout. And that has been pretty much the exclusive interpretation of an elevated uric acid that, in my experience, for many, many years, most of our practitioners would consider when uric acid is high, is that the person's on the way to gout. But what we're learning now, thanks to Dr. Perlmutter's book, and I'm recommending everyone to get this book, it's written in everyday language. It's not geeky at all. There's a whole lot of references to science, but he writes in a way that I've tried to model in my books in everyday language that just makes sense. So with that introduction, Dr. David, what took you down the path to write about this topic?
Well, let me begin by laying some groundwork that I've been interested in metabolic issues for decades, as you know, you have as well. That means issues like elevated blood pressure, blood sugar, increased body mass index, problems with our body fats that float around, and triglycerides as well. And these are the 5 components of what we call the metabolic syndrome. My interest in metabolic issues, especially the high blood pressure and the high blood sugar, even prior to diabetes, is that these things are the harbingers. They pave the way for a degenerating brain. And we live in a time, here in America where Alzheimer's is rampant. We have 6 million Alzheimer's patients in America right now, and that number is supposed to triple by the year 2050. And that's devastating. It's now the 3rd leading cause of death in America. And while we don't have any pharmaceutical treatment that works, we do recognize that many of our lifestyle choices pave the way for an increased risk of getting that incurable disease. And these are lifestyle choices that set the stage for problems with our metabolism. So That's been an interest of mine for an awful long time. Years ago, I wrote a book called Grain Brain that looked at how consuming sugar, who knew, was bad for the brain because it changes our metabolism. I was running a couple of years back, and I chanced upon a podcast interviewing a doctor Richard Johnson at the University of Colorado, who has done really most of the work revealing that, as exactly as you stated in your setup, that we all considered uric acid to be involved in things like gout and kidney stones. That's how we learned it. And that all fit really nicely into a package because person has high uric acid, you write them a prescription and then you move on. But what Dr. Johnson revealed, and others as well, that elevated uric acid is a powerful threat to our metabolism. That elevated uric acid is not just happening to be elevated in conjunction with obesity and diabetes and hypertension, it's playing a causative role. There's an interesting study that was published in 2016, collaborative study by a paper by researchers in Turkey and Japan, and it's entitled Uric Acid in Metabolic Syndrome, from Innocent Bystander to a Central Player. And it really sums it up that, it doesn't just happen to be elevated. This uric acid is, and we're going to explore how this happens, is actually, as a life-saving measure for our ancestors, it's telling our bodies right now, make and store as much fat as possible. Raise the blood pressure or you won't survive. Make more blood sugar to power the brain or you won't survive. So this elevation of uric acid that we uniquely have as humans in comparison to other mammals, our uric acid levels are 4 to 5 times higher than that of other mammals. Actually evolved in us around our ancestors about 15 million years ago as a survival mechanism. It really became a superpower, so that those individuals of our ancestors, our primate ancestors, that had these genetic mutations that led to higher levels of uric acid, they made more fat, they made more blood sugar, and they survived during times of food scarcity, like during, now this isn't going to be on the quiz, but during the middle Miocene period, when the earth was cool and there wasn't as much food. We inherited that.
So let's just summarize that first part for a minute, if I can. If I'm understanding you, our ancient ancestors who survived had to have skills to adapt to their environment.
Right.
And those that did not have that skill, they died and they did not reproduce. And so their offspring, their lineage just died out. But those that had the skill to adapt, they survived. They developed a way for their body to adapt to the lack of very much food at different times.
Right.
And one of the messengers that says, there's not so much food around right now, you better hoard and you better become really efficient. One of the messengers that those people that survived developed was to increase their uric acid.
Exactly. That was their superpower.
That's
and
the
they
superpower.
survived.
So
and the others who didn't have the high
right.
uric acid, they didn't, exactly like you say, they didn't reproduce. So we are not there. They are not our ancestors. We are not their descendants.
Right.
So
right.
this is
and
the
so,
reason.
And so you said something that kind of threw me at first. You said increase sugar. Well, that we've always thought we don't want more elevated blood sugar, but you have to have enough blood sugar to feed the brain. And so if you're not eating very much and your blood sugar is going way too low, you're not motivated, you're dragging, all of those signs of hypoglycemia that we talked about back in the 80s and the 90s. And so uric acid will increase blood sugar.
Yes. And to be more global about it, in the context of our ancestors, making body fat, storing body fat, being pre-diabetic, and having elevation of the blood pressure were wonderful things. Think about what we are saying right now in the context of food scarcity and the environment in which our ancestors lived. So here you have your guest on your program this evening, Dr. Perlmutter, saying diabetes, prediabetes, a good thing. Yeah, for our ancestors. Why? Well, as it relates to their mild elevation of blood sugar, that would power their brains and allow them to avoid two important things: starvation and predation. They would be clever enough because their brains are working to find food, and they would avoid predation, meaning they wouldn't be eaten by another animal. So again, this little tweak in physiology that caused a select group of pre-humans, and then now all of us, to make a little bit more uric acid caused them to have that superpower: more body fat, less metabolism of their body fat, so they would store it longer. Their energy metabolism would go down, and blood pressure would go up, so they could still have blood supply to their organs when they couldn't find water. The problem is we don't live in that world anymore. But we still are functioning with that primitive ancient physiology that's doing everything it can 365 days a year to keep us alive by making more fat when the switch is turned on. What is the switch? The switch is uric
So
acid.
let's stay with that for a moment, because the thought that I have is, and I don't know how many of you out there are a little bit geeky, or it turns you on to hear something that connects the dots. But for me, it's really exciting to understand that we are here today because our ancestors survived, and the skills that they developed to survive included increasing uric acid at times to make sure there was enough fuel for the brain so you could think clear enough to avoid a saber-toothed tiger, and you also could find food. Now, to me, that's exciting to know. So, and people say, well, I'd like to turn that off. How do I turn that off? Because
that switch is on in a lot of people, and it's screaming, make fat, store fat, increase the blood sugar, become insulin resistant. The very things that you and I have been working for decades, many decades, to try to educate people about in terms of the importance of these as underlying features of our most dreaded conditions. So what I've described is today we are feeling the consequences of this evolutionary environmental mismatch. Basically, our evolution provided us this physiology based upon our genes, but our current environment is playing upon that situation and creating what we call metabolic mayhem. And in the book, I put my first publication about this topic, which I wrote half a century ago in 1971 when I was 16. And I, in the Miami Herald, and I called attention at the end of that publication about what about those of us who are alive today living with the outdated machinery. It's outdated because our current environment is nothing like it was, so therefore we have this mechanism in place. And now let me get to your question. So why is the switch on? Why is uric acid screaming? Why have uric acid levels increased from an average of 3.5 milligrams per deciliter to around 6 milligrams per deciliter in going from 1920 here in America to around 1970? Dramatic rise in uric acid. So the question on the table is, where does it come from? It only comes from three things: alcohol, type of food breakdown product called purines, which is what we release when we eat foods that have a lot of cells. It's the DNA and the RNA in the cells that become something called purines. But the big issue today is fructose. Fructose is directly metabolized to uric acid. I just mentioned how dramatically uric acid levels have gone up between 1920 and 1970. That's in absolute lockstep with our consumption of fructose. Not all sugar, but uniquely fruit sugar. It was fruit sugar that signaled our hunter-gatherer ancestors that winter was coming, that turned on their body's production of uric acid, so that in the late summer and early fall, when fruit would ripen, have the highest amount of fructose, would make body fat. And those who had the mutations that led to higher uric acid, they became our ancestors.
So before people jump to the conclusion, what do you mean I can't eat fruit? Before they do that, that's not what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about the sequential order of how to lower your uric acid. And it's not that you have to avoid all fruit. What Dr. Perlmutter is talking about is fructose, the sugar that is naturally found in fruit, but unfortunately, the more common source now is called
High fructose corn
high
syrup.
fructose corn syrup. Thank you. High fructose corn syrup that's in all the beverage, so many of the beverages that we drink that are sweetened, and lots of the pastries and the inexpensive packaged foods. So let's talk about that for a minute. Where are these exposures coming from?
Great question. And let's get back to the fruit question, because I have to indicate that I don't think I've done a single podcast that question didn't come up. And it's a good question because, the very nature of the name, fructose, is fruit sugar. We can handle without any issue about 5 grams of fructose at a time. And that's about what you're going to find in an apple. Maybe if it's a big apple, it might have 8 grams of fructose, but understand it's the context that really matters. When you eat an apple, it's a little bit slower than drinking a glass of orange juice, for example, or apple juice. It's also delivered with fiber that slows the fructose absorption. It's also delivered with vitamin C that aids in uric acid excretion. And it also contains bioflavonoids that help to target an enzyme and turn it down that's involved in making uric acid. It's called xanthine oxidase. It's the same enzyme that's targeted by the gout drugs. So eat fruit. Have an apple or two a day. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, but 5 apples a day and the doctor you will pay. So you can't be eating tons and tons of fruit, but you know what? Have an apple or two. Similarly, I mentioned a moment ago the idea of what are called purines, the breakdown product of DNA and RNA. And is it an issue that relates to gout? Yes, it is. When you go online and look at some of the major clinics' websites, and they talk about diets people should go on to lower their uric acid if they have, for example, gout. It's all about eating low purine foods. That's the organ meats like liver and kidney and anchovies and sardines. They also mention cutting back on alcohol. Alcohol is metabolized to uric acid. I mentioned that. And low purine vegetables. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But why don't they mention the fructose? Why are these major institutions still not able to tell us that eating sugar is bad for human health? Because it is. The amount of sugar that you need in your diet is exactly 0 grams a day.
Right.
It is not needed for anything. And yet, even to this day, these major well-respected clinics on their websites tell you it's really the purines and it's the alcohol. Let me talk about purines for just a moment. So that's the breakdown product of DNA and RNA in things like liver and kidney and sardines and organ meats in general. There are some vegetables that are high in purines. There are the cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower, things like mushrooms, for example. Totally fine to eat those, and I strongly encourage them. As well as I do, these are the gifts.
We've been talking about those vegetables for years to help.
That's right.
Cancers.
And now you see stuff online saying, avoid these vegetables because they're high in purines. Well, one very large study of 42,000 people, a retrospective food questionnaire study, and there are others, demonstrate that people who have the highest, both men and women, the highest consumption of these high purine vegetables have the lowest uric acid levels, both men and women. Why? Similar to fruit, lots of fiber, lots of vitamin C, but in vegetables, you get even more of these uric acid lowering bioflavonoids like quercetin, for example.
Yes.
So here is our first reference, and there'll be another one later on in our time together, to the value of quercetin. Quercetin targets an enzyme in the body called xanthine oxidase that is required to make uric acid. Foods like vegetables are high in bioflavonoids, and oftentimes, like red onions, contain a lot of quercetin. Quercetin is a key supplement to help people lower their uric acid and be on the path to regaining their metabolic health. Because keep in mind, when uric acid is elevated, it's telling your body, make fat, raise the blood sugar, and raise the blood pressure.
So that people don't get confused as we're talking about all these bullet points. Am I correct in recommending in general that we do a sequential order of elimination for lowering uric acid, and the top of the list is the high fructose corn syrups and the added sugars, that you start there, don't worry about the vegetables that are high, the broccoli?
No, I embrace those vegetables. They should be on the list. They are actually associated with lower uric acid values. We talk about alcohol, and I think, again, context matters a lot. Hard alcohol is associated with an increased uric acid. Wine has generally no effect in men, but is actually associated with a slightly lower uric acid in women. But the worst player of all is beer, because beer has alcohol, but beer is also rich in purines. Once again, why? Made from brewer's yeast. So there's a lot of DNA and RNA or a lot of genetic material, rather, nucleic acids in the residuals of the brewer's yeast that are broken down to help increase the uric acid, telling the body, make a beer belly. We understand where it's coming from now. So in Japan, that's really taken a lead in uric acid research and has a lot of troubles with metabolic issues. They've now created purine-free beer. I mean, we've seen alcohol-free beer for a long time, but now in Japan, you can get beer without purines because they know how aggressive this beer is in terms of raising the uric acid level. So step one is to get your uric acid level checked. And that is something you go to the doctor for, or ask the doctor to call the lab, or you buy a home uric acid monitor. I have one right here on my desk. And you want to know where you are. I mean, you might be in good shape, you might not be. Here in America, we use units called milligrams per deciliter. And what the literature suggests is that you want to keep your uric acid level below 5.5. Now, if you go to the doctor, he or she is going to say, well, the lab said anything under 7 and you're good to go. Please remember that level of 7 deals with gout, because above 7, then uric acid starts to crystallize in the blood and can form gout crystals. But the cardiovascular risks for elevated uric acid begin really at around 5.5. So we want that uric acid at that level or lower. And this is what the monitor looks like. It's a little finger stick kind of thing, much as blood glucose. And here's my last level. I think you see 4.7. You check it. Then does this apply to you or not? And the average blood uric acid level in America in adults is 6. So the average is already high. Most people, therefore, need to do a little work. And the first...
excuse me. So on the monitor that you just showed us, it's a finger prick test. Is that correct?
Tiny, tiny little finger stick. Yes.
And so just poke your finger, you put a drop on there, and it'll tell you what your reading is. And everyone here who's heard many of our different shows know that we emphasize reducing inflammation. Am I correct in assuming that using your uric acid level as an introductory at-home monitor of am I inflamed or not, that when people have metabolic diseases developing, that the likelihood their uric acid is going to be above 5.5 is fairly high?
Yes, uric acid does its dirty work mechanistically by increasing inflammation, by increasing oxidative stress, damaging free radicals, by damaging mitochondrial function, by keeping us from using nitric oxide. We'll need to unpack that a little bit later because it's hugely important. So these are the mechanisms that are involved in how uric acid was a survival mechanism. Increased inflammation helped our ancestors survive infections. These days, chronic, in an acute sense, these days, chronic elevation of these inflammatory chemicals that we call cytokines is seen in coronary artery disease, diabetes, obesity, and certainly in Alzheimer's disease. It's a chronic inflammatory situation. So you're correct in your statement. Yes, inflammation is turned on dramatically. So is oxidative stress. So is damage to mitochondrial function. Who wants that? Not me.
Yeah, of course, of course. Now, many of our followers here have heard me talk about the reference from Blue Cross Blue Shield that came out in March of 2020 that said, we've got a problem here with early onset Alzheimer's. And they talked about from 2013 until 2017, in a 4-year period, there was a 407% increase in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 30 to 44-year-olds.
That's right. And, some would say, well, we're just able to make the diagnosis better and earlier these days. No. Alzheimer's is something that begins to manifest a couple, maybe 3 decades after a person becomes metabolically deranged, if you will. So that we are setting the stage for Alzheimer's for people in their 70s when they begin to experience things like prediabetes or diabetes or obesity or hypertension in their 30s and 40s. That is exceedingly common these days. In fact, in America, 88% of adults has at least one component of the metabolic syndrome, meaning only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. But to your point, metabolic issues are appearing in younger and younger people. So we're now commonly seeing significant rates of obesity in teenagers and hypertension and prediabetes and frank diabetes, full-grown diabetes. We used to call it adult onset diabetes. We can't do that anymore because we're seeing it in kids.
Right,
so that
agreed.
perfectly sets the stage for exactly what you described. And that is now this younger onset Alzheimer's disease 3 decades later. So that would be in 40s and 50s.
I've also talked about Health and Human Services Advisory Council in July of 2019 came out with a document that showed that the prodromal period in the development of Alzheimer's, that means before symptoms, the prodromal period went on for over 20 years of increased inflammation, killing off brain cells, killing off brain cells, killing off brain cells. And people feel fine while this is occurring. They don't know that their uric acid is high or that their insulin levels are high. They can't feel it. And then after 20 years of this slow deterioration, now they start getting some symptoms for about 7 or so years of what lane did I park my car in the parking lot? Or where did I put my keys? And that goes on for about 7 or so years. So as you said, the 3 decades, there's 3 decades of inflammation going on before there's ever a diagnosis for these people.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
that's happening at earlier and earlier ages.
That's right. And, what the studies have shown, one study, I think, published in 2016 in the journal Neurology, looked at what's called an inflammatory composite score, and they evaluated 28 years before a suite of inflammatory blood tests. Back then, it was other things like fibrinogen level, von Willebrand's factor, and total white blood cell count. These days, we would use tumor necrosis factor alpha, C-reactive protein, others. But anyway, that's what they used back then. Nonetheless, it worked and demonstrated that, in fact, those who had higher levels on this inflammatory panel had a dramatic increased risk of developing brain shrinkage as well as cognitive decline. And this was 28 years later. We've seen a similar study looking at basically body mass index as a predictor. We know that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. And more recently, we've seen a study in Annals of Rheumatology from 2018 looking at 1,600 people, followed them for 12 years. And what they did, interestingly, was they measured their uric acid level at the beginning of the study and followed this group of people for 12 years. What did they find? Well, they did neurocognitive testing every 2 years along the way. And at the end of the study, they found that those individuals who at the beginning of the study had an elevated uric acid had an 85% increased risk of developing dementia, a 55% increased risk of developing actual Alzheimer's disease,
Wow.
and a 166% increased risk of developing vascular or mixed dementia. Now, we don't have any meaningful treatment here for these people. And
Right.
yet we're seeing this relationship that is profound. And this takes us back to something I mentioned earlier, and that is how uric acid inhibits the function of a chemical called nitric oxide. And what does nitric oxide do? Nitric oxide allows blood vessels to relax so blood flow can happen. It's the reason that men who have erectile dysfunction take Viagra, because Viagra increases nitric oxide, and then they can have blood supply, and that can be helpful for erectile dysfunction. As a segue, interestingly, a study was published 6 weeks ago looking at 6 million medical records here in America and found that men who took Viagra had a 70% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's. Just saying. The reason I'm just saying is because it tends to solidify our understanding of the importance of this mechanism of nitric oxide's role in blood supply.
Right.
So we can understand then why people with a high uric acid might be at higher risk for stroke, and they are by about 35% over 8 years, but also how they would be at higher risk for things like vascular dementia. But there's another very interesting piece of this puzzle that I think you'll really be. I'm excited about it, and I think you will be too. And it's another role of nitric oxide that we really haven't embraced until quite recently. And that is, nitric oxide is fundamentally important for the ability of insulin to do its job. That insulin requires nitric oxide to get out of the artery as well as to get in to bind to the surface of the cell. Without adequate nitric oxide, we create immediately a compromise of insulin's function. Call it insulin resistance, if you will. And this is brought about by higher levels of uric acid. So the dirty work done by high levels of uric acid as it relates to nitric oxide compromises our blood supply and, in addition, enhances insulin resistance by reducing the effectiveness of insulin in the body. Now, both of these were survival mechanisms. When you keep the blood pressure elevated because you cannot relax the arteries, that's a good thing to have when the person might be dehydrated, because you still have high blood pressure. You can perfuse your brain, your heart, your kidneys. And similarly, the insulin resistance we talked about gives you higher levels of blood sugar so you can power your brain, your ace in the hole, if you're a hunter-gatherer or any type of human for that matter. So it's some really fascinating biochemistry that is, they're really interesting segues, like the use of nitric oxide increasing drugs like Viagra, sildenafil.
I know. Yeah, this is extremely exciting for Dr. Perlmutter and I know for many people it's over your head already. I know that, but you're going to listen to it again. You can listen to it on YouTube or on Facebook Live. And as you listen to it, the key takeaways so far are: avoid at all costs, never, ever, ever do you eat anything or drink anything with high fructose corn syrup, ever, because it's going to throw your metabolism out of balance. That's a key takeaway to begin with. Another takeaway is some of you will want to get a little device at home so you can check your uric acid levels. And especially if you're currently dealing with a blood sugar problem, an obesity problem, a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease, that this is one of the biomarkers that you can easily monitor yourself at home and check and see, how is my lifestyle working to begin lowering this thing? Now, Dr. David, if someone has an elevated uric acid level and they're going to go on, they're avoiding high fructose corn syrup, they're going for the cruciferous vegetables and mushrooms and more natural foods, how long before they can expect to see some results? Because if they check tomorrow and it's the same and they didn't drink their iced tea sweetened with high fructose corn syrup last night, but they're not better the next morning, is that realistic, or how long should they
this
be
mechanism
patient
does
to
everything
see a
it
result?
can to help you survive. And that means
Right.
that uric
Right.
acid does everything it can once it's elevated in your body to stay elevated to help you, in times of food scarcity, survive. As an example, we know that as I just described, that ultimately uric acid is going to cause your insulin level to go up. But high levels of insulin decrease your excretion of uric acid, so it makes your uric acid level go up. So these two things are going to make each other worse. But the uric acid, if people suddenly make these important lifestyle changes, will drop within a couple, as in 2 weeks. One interesting study looked at a group of 22 young men with elevated uric acid in England, and gave them quercetin, 500 milligrams a day, and their uric acid levels, no other changes to their diets, placebo controlled. Their uric acid levels in 8 weeks dropped by 8%. That is really, really significant. I want to go back and mention one other thing, and that is, we've been told for years, start your day with a 12-ounce glass of fresh organic fruit juice. What could be better? Well, there's, and on the carton it says all natural orange juice or apple juice, whatever it may be. There's nothing natural about fruit juice. That's not
Right.
how it comes in nature. You're not walking through the jungle and suddenly you find cartons of orange juice
Right.
hanging from a tree. There's nothing natural about bombarding your body with 36 grams of sugar quickly, especially if you're thirsty, overwhelming your small intestine's ability to deal with that fructose, goes right to the liver and sets into motion all of these mechanisms that we've talked about that so threaten the metabolic health of each and every person. Nobody's going to get away with that. And it's the typical thing we do. You're at a restaurant, you have breakfast, they're going to start pouring the OJ, or, at lunch, well, maybe it's, and what do you give infants? A bottle with apple juice, get them started early.
Yes.
And, to
Yeah.
relate back to our discussion of the early and earlier Alzheimer's. So I think that your comment is excellent about the fructose, but I think that your viewers need to know that it's hidden in so many foods by other names, and that more than 60% of the packaged foods in the grocery store have added sweeteners, and by and large, these are derivatives of, or frankly, high fructose corn syrup, because it's really sweet. Fructose is much sweeter than glucose, and it's cheap to make, and our government subsidizes it, for crying out loud. That's a bit bonkers. And listen, table sugar, sucrose, that white table sugar that you put 3 spoons on your cereal in the morning, whatever you do, not you, of course, but table sugar is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Make no mistake about it. That's a huge load of fructose in the morning. So let me, I've been reading some of the comments on some of the YouTube videos lately, and you are correct that the science is a little bit overwhelming. So let me take a couple of minutes and step this down just a little bit.
Yes, please.
We are suffering from a pandemic, the number one pandemic on our planet that's responsible for more deaths than anything else right now. And it's called the pandemic of chronic degenerative conditions. I didn't say COVID. I said chronic degenerative conditions, according to the World Health Organization. These are things like heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's, for example. At their core are disturbances of our metabolism. Elevation of uric acid is playing a central role in disturbing our metabolism. Therefore, to rein in our metabolism and help us reduce our risk for the number one cause of death on the planet, we've got to know and then control our uric acid levels, meaning we got to get tested as part of our yearly exam or tests at home. This is going to attain a position on the top shelf with blood pressure, blood sugar, fasting insulin, and body weight. You'll see uric acid listed right there. We need to know and control our uric acid. That's the gateway for improving our metabolic health. Now, you mentioned earlier, especially people who have high blood sugar, who are obese, who have hypertension, you bet this could be that missing link that they've done everything. They're taking the medicines, they've changed their diets, still not happening. These are the folks especially that need to find out right now what their uric acid levels are. And again, the doctors will tell you that anything under 7 milligrams per deciliter is in the normal range. And I would submit that anybody listening to Tom O'Brien does not want to be just in the normal range. They want to be in the optimal, tip-top range, and that is at 5.5 or lower.
Right. Now, what's too low for uric acid? How low is too low?
It's difficult to say. I don't really think there is too low. We do see very, very low uric acids correlated with end-stage Alzheimer's. And again, uric acid is made from purines, the breakdown product of DNA and RNA. And let me preface it by saying that 2/3 of the purines in anyone's body come from within. They come from the breakdown of our own tissue as we break down muscle every day when we exercise or whatever we do. Only 1/3 of the purines come from the diet. But you can imagine a person who's wasted away, a cachectic individual with very little muscle mass. They have a very low resource now to make uric acid from purines in their bodies. And I think that's the likely explanation for really low levels of uric acid. So, by and large, we want to get those levels down. Mine's at 4.7, and I'm working to get it even lower. I eat some fruit, but not a lot. I do like anchovies, but I eat just a few when I have a Caesar salad. I never could eat liver. It has nothing to do with uric acid or purines. I could never stand it. Believe me, I ran away from home when my mother cooked liver as a kid. And kidneys I haven't even considered, but it does speak to the portion size, though, of our meat choices. Things like fish and scallops, especially shellfish, have them, but you might consider reducing your portion size. In Drop Acid, we created what's called the LUV diet, LUV, and that stands for lower uric values. And we do include some animal products and some meats, etc. But, we're really careful about the portion size. I mean, we all have a tendency to eat, a big fillet of fish or whatever it may be. And you can probably get away with that, but you don't know until you're following your uric acid. Is it just a new layer of work to do on top of having your continuous glucose monitor and all the other things that you want to do? It is. But, you're paving the way for a healthy future. You don't want to be 70 and start getting the diagnoses and start getting the prescriptions and, living your life like that. So it's not just about lifespan, but it's about health span. It's about, getting on into your years and being healthy and able to do the things that you enjoy doing during your golden years as well. But it's also hugely important for younger people. One study published, as a matter of fact, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, looked at kids, I think they were 11 to 17 years of age, obese, mild elevation of their uric acid, but pre-hypertensive. In other words, greater than or equal to 120/80. They gave them gout medicine that is used to lower their uric acid. Lo and behold, their blood pressures went down. My point being, and I'm not advocating using drugs. If they're needed, fine. I'm simply saying that it solidifies our understanding of the role of uric acid in blood pressure. The role in obesity is clear. The role in diabetes, very, very clear. So it's new information, and it's really very exciting.
It is. And as in all of your books and in my books, we talk about lifestyle changes. And I want everyone to know that as you focus on the uric acid aspect of lifestyle, and you get Dr. Perlmutter's book and you begin the Love Diet, you're monitoring your uric acid level, you don't have to do that the rest of your life. It won't take too long before you've got this down, and then you're just monitoring it every 6 months or every year. You just have to put some focused attention on it right now if it's elevated. And it won't take long to bring it down a couple of months.
Yeah, we are kind of convinced that we can live our lives however we choose and the doctor will fix it. You know, you roll into the doctor's office with high blood pressure and you're on a medication. Diabetes, you're on a medication. There is no medically approved or pharmaceutical treatment for high blood pressure or diabetes for that matter. What did I just say? Wait a minute. There is no drug that treats high blood pressure. There are plenty of drugs out there that treat the symptoms, meaning the high blood will lower the blood pressure, but you can be sure as soon as you stop the medication, blood pressure goes back up. So you've not treated the problem. Same thing with diabetes. I gave a talk to a group of mainstream doctors a couple of years back, and I asked the audience, what's your go-to treatment for diabetes? And the hands went up. This doctor said sulfonylureas. This doctor said metformin. And I said, none of the things you've mentioned treat the diabetes. What happens when you stop these drugs? And they said, well, the blood sugar goes back up. So you haven't treated the problem. You've treated the smoke, but you've ignored the fire. And we really need to do our very best to give people the agency to make the very lifestyle choices that you've been talking about so that they can actually treat the underlying problem and not need these drugs. Am I anti-drug? Absolutely not. If there's a drug needed to do a particular task, I'm in. But at the same time, we want to attack the underlying fire, not just the smoke. And to do this in a preventive way is even more meaningful. You know, to keep people healthy. What a goal. You know, John Kennedy said that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And that's why I write these books. And, you know, because this is information that many people will read and not pay any attention to, but some will pay a lot of attention to it. You know, back in Grain Brain 2013, some people stopped eating sugar and thought that perhaps gluten might be responsible for their joint pain or headaches. And so there are, you know, a number of people out there who gained a benefit from that. And we're going to continue to do that. And much to the dismay of the pharmaceutical companies, I was interviewed on a show, CBS This Morning, with a couple of years ago now. I think it was Gail King was interviewing me, along with all of the whole team was there. And they start off by saying, you know, Dr. Perlmutter, you told us that in Grain Brain, that we shouldn't eat sugar. But we reached out to the sugar industry and they said eating sugar in moderation is totally fine. And I said, you know, that is like the initial messaging from the tobacco company telling us that smoking was good for our health.
Right.
Sugar is not needed in the human diet at all. And it is threatening us like never before. It's a powerful signal to prepare for winter. Why does the bear eat so many berries before it hibernates? Because it needs to make fat, it needs to store fat, and it needs to turn down its metabolic burn, its metabolism, so it's not using all that energy when it's hibernating. And it does so by activating a pathway called AMP deaminase, and that is what is activated with elevated uric acid.
Let's go to a few questions here because there's a ton of questions.
Okay.
The first one from Mary on Zoom, she asked, is there an allergy and uric acid connection?
It's a very good question, and some has been written about it. Uric acid does tend to destabilize the gut lining, leading to what we call permeability, more colloquial, as a colloquium known as leaky gut syndrome. So this permeability of the gut can imbalance our immune responses and may be responsible for a heightened state of immune response, which could be characterized as being an allergy. So there is, there is the possibility of a connection there. Very good question.
Jill on Facebook says, hello, Dr. Perlmutter and Dr. Tom. I have uric acid levels around 2.5. My internist says it's not a problem, but my functional medicine doctor says it's due to a possible B12, folic acid, and molybdenum. I assume a lack of those nutrients.
Yeah, I would not say that there's a direct relationship. I'd be thrilled to have that. I don't see what the problem is. I'd be thrilled to have that uric acid level, but I don't know what her units are. So we need to understand if she's talking about milligrams per deciliter, because in some places the units are different. But I would say that, at least the B12 and the folate, always a good choice for anybody, but, there may be some other things that the functional medicine doctor identified, like MTHFR polymorphism or elevated homocysteine, for which those are being recommended.
JJ Sabat on Instagram asks, how do you turn off the switch?
You turn off the switch by, there's several things you do. First, you limit the inputs, which means you reduce, as we talked about, dramatically the fructose. You look at your alcohol consumption, recognizing wine is the best choice. Hard alcohol and beer are not such great choices. And you look at your purine consumption. Those are the inputs to make uric acid. Then you look at some other interesting things that you can do. Vitamin C, 500 milligrams a day, helps us excrete uric acid. The bioflavonoid quercetin, which you can get at the health food store, 500 milligrams a day, along with something else called luteolin, another bioflavonoid, 100 milligrams per day, dramatically reduces the enzyme activity that is needed to make uric acid. So those are things you could add. The other thing that you can buy is something called Tart cherry extract. Now, that's been sort of folklore treatment for gout for a long time. But in writing Drop Acid, I uncovered the literature that says, you bet, Tart cherry extract is significantly associated with lowering of uric acid. If you look at the O on the, that's backwards, I guess, on the Drop Acid, that's a cherry. That's the cherry falling down. And that's why we did that, because Tart cherry really does help lower uric acid.
Sophia on Facebook says, please, is it possible to get rid of Toefi in knee muscles due to synovial inflammation?
Anything is possible. So these Toefi, one would wonder what has led to their genesis. And, we see Toefi formed when uric acid level is elevated. Will they go away with time? Probably yes. You might want to add some higher levels of vitamin C and even consider the use of ultrasound to help break them up.
Jim on Zoom asks, what are the various ways that we can test how efficient and effective our fat metabolism is? I've heard stool floating is a sign the fat's not being processed, but are there other at-home challenge tests or labs you respect greatly to establish where we stand with the type and amount of fats we're consuming daily?
That's a very, the fats that we are consuming daily versus our fat metabolism, these are kind of different areas. I'm happy to talk about both of them. So as it relates to fat metabolism, there are various types of body scans that we can get that will measure the amount of body fat that we have, and more importantly, will determine where that body fat is located. Is it surrounding our internal organs? Is it accumulating in our butts or in our arms and legs? Which is actually very, very important in terms of the threat that it might represent in terms of inflammation and risk for certain things like cardiovascular disease. So those types of scans are readily available. Another very, very sophisticated instrument is called a tape measure. So a tape measure is really a pretty handy way to determine what's going on with fat metabolism in your body. But I would think that one thing, if you're going to be looking at simple measurements, would be looking at some of the liver transaminase enzymes like AST. This will give you a sense as to how much fat buildup is in the liver. And this is part of the whole program of of depositing fat or increasing the genesis of fat in your body, that might be a good thing to follow. Recognize that one of the key players in telling your body to make more fat is uric acid. So a great place to start would be the uric acid level.
Right, right. We've got a guest here who wanted to come in. He brought me a diaper in case I needed one, but he was hitting on the door. You know, this is the first time he's ever been hitting on the door.
He's wanting to hear what we're talking about.
Wants to hear it. This is such an important topic.
See, I was right.
Mary asked the question. So the modified fruits that have higher sugar, such as white peaches, Honeycrisp apples, those have higher fructose amounts compared to heirloom varieties. Yes,
that's correct. You know, apples were originally quite bitter. Yeah. And she is correct. I mean, these are not modified; they are cultivars. So you know, these are things that have happened over many, many years of selective cultivation, and it's not as if they are genetically modified to increase their sugar content, but they've been selected for by virtue of both bigger size and higher sugar content. So you're right. A very large Honeycrisp apple is going to have quite a bit of fructose in it. You know, eating a lot of grapes. One of the biggest concerns, of course, would be dried fruits where the fructose level is really high. So those can be associated with elevating uric acid.
An anonymous on Zoom asks, is a strong ammonia smell in the urine an indication of high uric acid?
No, it is not. That has to do with our metabolism of amino acids. And, you know, sometimes people say, is the blood urea nitrogen the same thing as uric acid? And again, that has to do with metabolism of amino acids and unrelated, though the names sound similar.
Okay. Another anonymous question on Zoom. Is it true or not true that meat results in multiple times the amount of acid load on the kidneys relative to non-animal proteins? Or is the acid load primarily on the liver? Because we produce less hydrochloric acid as we age, might it make less sense for those of older age to eat meats? Would that require more energy and more acid to break everything down and to ensure the acids are all clearing out fully?
With all due respect, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but let me just sort of give an answer and hope that it covers the waterfront here. And that is that you know, there's a lot more involved in our digestion of meat than simply acid-based chemistry, though acid-based chemistry plays a role in terms of enzyme activation, that's for sure. I think what we're really looking for is the effect of bile acids and other enzymes for the digestion process. I think that the innuendo here is that perhaps elderly people should be eating less meat, and I am somewhat in favor of that. Because I think they may not need as much. But I think what we're learning these days is that we've kind of underestimated the protein needs of people in general, and certainly those who are beginning to lose muscle mass. So I think protein, if you choose to eat animal protein, is something that is very important. Animal protein, of course, is a good way of getting iron and keeping your iron status where it needs to be. But can you do this as a vegetarian? You bet you can. That's really, I think, the beauty of what we call the love diet, lower uric values, is you can embrace the love diet and incorporate it into your keto plan, your vegetarian, vegan plan, any really one of the paleo plan, whatever is, you know, your choice in terms of these very popular dietary schemes. You can look at those dietary choices based on looking through the lens of how they affect uric acid. That's why in the book, we have 40 recipes that are perhaps paleo, perhaps keto, that allow, and vegetarian for sure, that allow people to target uric acid while not abandoning their dietary preferences.
Jorge on YouTube asked the question, wonder if meat and organ diet along with high fruit will cause problems. Carnivore MD recommends that, and he appears healthy. I
think the main thing that we become concerned about, or at least I do, in talking to people who eat all animal-based products, is their lack of dietary fiber. We need to nurture our gut bacteria. Our gut bacteria are involved in the excretion of 30% of the uric acid that's excreted from our bodies. That's just one reason we need to nurture our gut bacteria.
Right.
I mean, we could spend several more hours talking about why it's important. So I eat meat, not a lot. I eat fish, I eat fowl, I eat eggs. I eat eggs almost every day. I have a little dairy product, not much. But I load my plate with vegetables, colorful vegetables, to ensure I'm getting a wide variety of nutrients and certainly plenty, I mean, plenty of dietary fiber. Fruit is a good thing on the plate, but again, this is a question of quantity now. So I think that should have answered the question.
I think so too. Colin asked the question, I visited my neurologist a few days ago who suggested after a normal MRI brain scan that I should look into FND. For months now, I've been walking around like a drunk, having difficulty breathing, headaches, neck pain, also lower back and thigh sensations with rheumatic pain generally. Is there a connection to uric acid?
Could very well be. And so I would strongly ask you, and good on the neurologist to talk about FMD. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but man, oh man, what a world, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's more to the story here. I certainly wouldn't say that, you know, go on a fasting mimicking diet and that's going to help your problem. I think job one is to determine what is the problem here. And then we will discuss what, you know, treatment options may be. But for this type of individual, I would want to know some inflammatory markers like sedimentation rate and C-reactive protein. The thought of polymyalgia rheumatica comes to mind, something he or she may wish to discuss with the neurologist, but I'm certainly happy that the MRI is normal. FMD is an acronym for fasting mimicking diet, a dietary program that, while you're not necessarily fully fasting, although you're certainly restricting calories aggressively on the front end, is designed by Professor Walter Longo as a way of allowing you to eat more food, not a full amount of food, but more food than you would if you're totally fasting, and still reap the benefits of what you might get when you are fasting. I'll be meeting with Dr. Longo in a couple of weeks. We are speaking in London.
Marvelous, marvelous. We're at the end of the time. I mean, it just goes so fast, you know, and there's so many more questions. I'm going to recommend, please, everyone, order Dr. Perlmutter's book. You may open it up to any page. And I've said this about my books, and I feel the same about David's books. Open it up to any page. Read one paragraph. If it doesn't interest you, put the book down. But what you'll find
that's fair enough.
Every paragraph, there's something that always captures you. You know, I said, "Whoa, that's really interesting. I didn't know that." And it's just an excellent book, And as has been the case for so many years, and you know, you referenced this phrase earlier in the show here, treating the smoke instead of the fire. And you used that on stage, it must have been 15 years ago, and that just caught me at that time. And I said, my gosh, that's exactly what our message should be on every imbalance that people have. Stop treating the smoke and find out where the fire is.
That's right.
And you've carried that message, David, for so many years now, and you're at the peak of the field. Thank you so much for being our leader on this.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. And it's great to reconnect. I think you and I are on a call again tomorrow. That's pretty exciting.
That is.
Look forward to talking to you then. But thanks again for having me. I sure appreciate the opportunity.
It's really a pleasure. And everyone, order the book. And thanks so much for being here tonight. And